Jason, are we recording?
Yes, we are.
Great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Joe Jenham, Dean and Director of Athletics at Mount San Antonio College in California, and the first Vice President of NATYCAA. COVID-19 has had an impact on all of our lives over the last several months, and with the cancellation of our convention this June, we have the opportunity to pivot and bring you a virtual presentation from Greg Dana and the staff at the NCAA. Before we begin the presentation, please take a moment to mute your microphones to avoid any additional background noise. If time permits, we may be able to answer additional questions at the end. Please use the chat feature and direct questions to myself. Also utilize the speaker view in the top corner of the application to follow along with the presentation. And now let me introduce Greg Dana. Greg has been with the NCAA for 13 years. He is currently the Associate Director of Academic and Membership Affairs and has been the primary liaison for the two-year colleges since 2013. He manages internal business for the department and holds a bachelor's in accounting from Indiana University and a master's in education from Michigan State University. Without further ado, please welcome Greg Dana.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on wherever you are. Before we get started, I do want to recognize that we're in a COVID environment, and I hope you and your families are safe, and that all of your student athletes and your staff and their families are safe. I recognize many of you have family members or people close to you who are out on the front lines doing important work, and I want to thank them for their service. And I also recognize you have people in your communities who have been directly impacted by COVID, and we're thinking about them as well. So as we all try to get through this together, we're keeping that front and center in all of our minds. Again, as Joe said, my name is Greg Dana. I'm an associate director with the NCAA, and we're going to talk mostly about Division I updates today that impact the two-year college community. Little bit of touching on Division II and Division III, but if you have specific questions about those other two divisions after this presentation, I'd be happy to address those offline. Also, as Joe said, I've been the two-year college community primary liaison for the NCAA since 2013. I'm one of the handful of people in our office who walks around every day thinking about you all, your campuses, and your kids. And we really appreciate opportunities to partner with you all as we talk about the broader picture of intercollegiate athletics and about the broader scope of college education in this country and the partnership that the two-year colleges and the four-year colleges have. So I want to specifically thank Joe and NATYCAA for bringing us on board and letting us share this time with you today. We have 4 presenters, and we're going to not talk about the agenda in order, but that's what we're going to talk about today. My first presenter is Danielle Tietzel. She's been at the NCAA slightly longer than me. She's really our primary expert on everything that has to do with reinstatement, seasons of competition, 5-year clocks, all of those kinds of things related to eligibility. Danielle is the one. So she's going to talk a lot about hardship waivers, things that the kids have to deal with moving from the 2-year to the 4-year school, and those kinds of situations, which obviously impacts COVID is going to impact, and also the season of competition eligibility in all 3 divisions. PJ Hubert is going to join us. PJ is a newer addition to our staff. He's been with us just a handful of years. He's a former Division I basketball player, and he probably does lots of things that I'm not thinking about. I think of PJ as our recruiting and basketball expert. So he's our go-to guy for everything that has to do with recruiting and basketball. I know nothing about either of those. So PJ is going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the basketball world. COVID again hits as we're trying to implement all of our basketball reform initiatives, and PJ is our front and center guy on those kinds of things. And then finally, Jerry Vaughn is going to join us. Jerry's 7 or 8 years, probably almost 10 in our national office, and he's our name, image, likeness expert. As you all know, this is a really big deal in all of your states, and the NCAA is working closely with state legislators and Congress to define an environment that can be acceptable for student athletes to have access to their own name, image, likeness rights, but also preserve our fundamental value of amateurism. And Jerry is front and center on that. Madison, for us.
Will you let Sergeant in the backyard so he doesn't bark?
Hey, Danielle, can you go on mute?
Sorry, guys.
We'll let Jerry talk about name, image, likeness. And then also we're having big changes in our 4-4 transfer environment. Doesn't directly impact your 2-year college transfers, but does as we relate to transferring in general. in Division I. So with that, I'm going to give it right to Danielle to kick us off, talk about student athlete reinstatement.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for your patience. I am home like many of you with a dog, 2 kids, and a husband. So before my enormous German Shepherd barked at whatever the moment called him to do so, I wanted to put him in the backyard. So I apologize. Thank you so much for inviting us, and Greg is too kind to me. I know some stuff about a lot of things, as most of us do, right? And with me on the call today is my peer, Brad Rockman. Brad's joining to help with questions or things that I might not be able to cover. And he has been at the NCAA for a long time as well, and primarily works with the Division I Committee on Student Athlete Reinstatement. So Greg, if we can go back one slide there, and maybe even one more. Okay, perfect, awesome. So our purpose here today with you to discuss with you are seasons of competition / participation waivers. There's a slash there because Division III calls those waivers participation waivers, whereas Division I and Division II reference them as season of competition waivers. Semantics for you, but important that we educate you on the wording that each of the divisions use. So obviously, Brad and I process cases from all 3 divisions, so we have to know the legislation across all 3 divisions when it comes to these waivers. But the 3 primary ones that we process that are relevant to your work include the hardship waiver appeals, the extension requests, and season of competition / participation waivers while eligible. Okay, Greg. In general, student athlete reinstatement, we as the staff have been given the authority from our committee to make all initial decisions, except for, as noted on the screen here, hardship waivers. As you all may track or may be aware, conference offices across all 3 divisions have the authority to be the first reviewer of hardship waivers. If those conference offices are unable to approve those hardship waivers, the institutions can then file those with our student athlete reinstatement staff as a hardship waiver appeal, and our staff can then take a look at the facts involved with those particular cases. Every other waiver that we process, we are the first reviewers. Okay. So what are the differences between the 3 waiver types that I mentioned to you? The hardship waiver appeal involves circumstances when a student athlete participates in one of their 4 seasons limitedly and in the first half of the season, right, prior to suffering from an injury or illness to themselves. That's a big component that I want you to remember. You all see the same type of circumstances. Student athlete competes 2 contests, and volleyball, blows out an ACL, right? These are the waivers that we're talking about here. Primarily the same legislation across all 3 divisions now, put a placeholder in that because I'm gonna go back to the future, or back to the past in just a minute. The one variation in wording in Division III is an injury or illness occurs when the student athlete has not participated in more than 1/3 of the standard denominator plus 1. Right, so our legislation captures 3 or 30% of a season, or not more than 1/3 plus 1 of the denominator in each sport. Now I say I'm going to reference the past because as you all are tracking, Division II used to be 2 or 20% with no first half of the season component, right? So you all were having to figure out, oh my goodness, 1 and 3 have a first half and 30%, 2 doesn't have a first half and 20%. So 2017, it was effective that Division II changed that legislation and moved to 30% with the first half of the season component. So we're all standardized at the time being. But as you know, our institutions can propose legislation to change this per the legislative process. So currently, this is where all 3 divisions are. Shifting gears a bit for extension requests, these are circumstances where student athletes within their clock, because Division I has a 5-year clock, so at the point you enroll full-time, you start your clock. Division II and Division III have semesters. semesters of full-time enrollment. So the count's a bit different there, right? And that's a distinguishing factor across the three divisions here. But in extension requests, what we're looking for are student athletes that have 2 years where they did not participate due to one of those extenuating circumstances listed below. Typically, we see an incapacitating injury or illness of the student athlete or of an immediate family member. That's typically what we see. So, for example, in women's basketball, the student athlete had a major injury prior to the season and could not come back for that particular season. Let's say that was in 18-19. As long as the institution has contemporaneous medical documentation to show that that young person could not come back to participate, then we would say that that is one denied year for that particular student athlete. Again, we are looking for 2 denied years within the student athlete's period of eligibility. The thing I think you guys get from our institutions a lot are requests specific to if your student athletes were on what we call a squad list or eligibility list. And if I could see all of your pictures, I'm guessing I would see your heads go like this. We have legislation in Division I and Division II specific to extensions, where if a student athlete was on the team in his or her initial year and appeared on the squad list or eligibility list, depending on division, and were otherwise athletically and academically eligible, that year can be considered a year when they were unable to participate in one of the 2 that we're looking for to grant extra time, whether that be an extra year in the clock or extra semesters. So you're probably familiar with getting requests from our institution specific to, were they on a roster? Were they on a non-participant list? Were they recruited? So those are questions that our institutions are asking you because our legislation requires, if there is no eligibility or squad list, what other objective documentation can we use to show that the young person was actually on the team and it was a coach's decision not to play him or her? Okay, Greg. Are you frozen?
Sorry, friends, I'm frozen.
Oh, no. Okay. Well,
Keep
let
going,
me
Danielle.
go. Let me go based on memory.
There you go.
There we go. So again, the last waiver type that we process, season of competition participation waivers. Again, the distinction there in the language is dependent upon division. 1 and 2 call it a season of competition. Division 3 calls it a season of participation. Same criteria in these type of waivers as the hardship waiver. The big difference here is while the hardship waiver deals with the student athlete that participated limitedly and then suffered themselves an injury or illness, these are situations where a student athlete participated limitedly and something else happened outside of their person. Injury or illness to family member, extreme financial difficulty, or an institution dropped the sport. COVID impact. Okay, so each division is a little bit different here, a little dicey. So the overarching question is, will season of competition waivers or extension requests approved by other organizations, your organization, be honored by the NCAA? In Division I, what the council said was that the NCAA institutions cannot self-apply, meaning they can't automatically give waivers for student athletes that were not competing at an NCAA institution to those student athletes, so your student athletes. What that means is, it doesn't mean that your young people, if they transfer to our institution, won't get the waiver. It just means that that divisional institution, that Division I institution, needs to file the particular waiver through our online case management system. So I don't want you to read that no and think, oh my gosh, they're not going to get it. There's still a way for them to get it. It just can't be self-applied by Division I. Division I has to file it through our case management system. Moving on to Division II. In fact, yes, If you approve a waiver for your student athlete based on a COVID circumstance, then rules and decisions made by your organization regarding the use of a season and the addition of a semester will follow that student athlete upon transfer. Division III might be the most tricky. So when we're talking about the use of a season of participation, yes, that particular waiver will come over if the student athlete transfers to a Division III institution after you all have provided that waiver relief to them. However, it's a little different with the use of a season. Division III basically said, if COVID canceled your season and you're a spring sports student athlete, we're not going to charge you with the use of that semester. So you have an extra semester on our end. However, what they're saying about transfers from non-NCAA institutions is, but if you, the non-NCAA institution, the student athlete enrolled full-time there at your two-year institution and ultimately triggered the use of a full-time term per our definition for Division III's definition, then they will use that term. And then when they come to a Division III institution, again, the Division III institution needs to file that extension request through our online case management system. So a little bit of a morph in Division III with Division I, but a bunch of nuances here. So certainly if you have questions or if student athletes have questions about that, you can certainly direct those to Greg, and Brad and I are happy to help. At this point, I think my part is done. Brad, I will pause a second, see if you have anything to add, or very brief second, because I know we're on a time crunch. Okay, excellent. And then I'll pause.
Nope. Yeah, Danielle, we're good. We're going to keep rolling and take questions at the end. I know you have to jump off, so any of the things that's difficult that I can answer, I'll just gather up and circle up with you after the presentation. I really appreciate you jumping on and helping us today.
And Greg,
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And Greg, just a reminder to anyone who's joined late, we can accept some questions in the chat feature directed to me.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
So, thanks, Danielle. We're going to move to PJ. I have to move back because we're jumping out of order. PJ's, like I said, he's going to talk about men's basketball. I forgot when I was introducing PJ that his newest responsibility is he's going to join me as a liaison to the two-year college community. That started actually about 6 months ago. So if you're going to remember somebody else's name as somebody in our office who's thinking about your kids and your institutions every day, that's also going to be PJ. So those are the two of us you can reach out to if you have specific questions or issues. And PJ's already worked with Joe and some of your other leadership. And I know on this group, this is mostly your leadership within NATYCAA. So PJ is another good name for you all to have. So with that, PJ, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Sure, appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for letting us join you today. Like Greg said, I'm looking forward to working with you all in the two-year college space as well moving forward. But as far as men's basketball updates go, I got two main things I want to just kind of touch on here related to summer recruiting and what that looks like in this COVID world that we're living in. And then two, some of just being transparent from other stakeholders side of things, working with the NBA and kind of what we're doing with the whole process there. So from a summer recruiting perspective, as I'm sure you all are working as well from a two-year college perspective with how you're doing workouts and how spring sports ended and what fall sports look like, we are doing the same thing. So process-wise, we've got all kinds of feedback that we've sought from various oversight committees. So your football oversight, your men's and women's basketball oversight committees. And then that has kind of been shot up the ladder to your Division I council and council coordination committees. They've ultimately been kind of deciding on dates and where we're going with how we're working with this virtual world and recruiting, and then how this kind of impacts our summer / possibly fall recruiting events. So where we're at right now is that what we call the NCAA Division I Council Coordination Committee, they've extended this temporary COVID-19 dead period through June 30th in all Division I sports. So what's that mean for us in the basketball world is that we basically, at least right now, have lost out on 2 April certified event. We, generally non-scholastic AAU tournaments. our 2 June weekends for high school events and our 2 June weekends for our 2-year college intercollegiate events. And so where we're at with that right now is the WBCA and the NABC, so your coaches associations in the basketball world, have recommended that the dead period be extended through July 31st. So wouldn't you know that today actually is when the 3C, the Council Coordination Committee, is actually going to start reviewing a few more items. One of those includes possibly extending this dead period through July. Does that mean we'll have a definitive decision from that committee today on if we're going to, extend this dead period through July? Maybe, maybe not. We've had a couple meetings previous weeks where they've had to seek further feedback via email or hop on additional calls. So that's one that just maybe keep an eye out for. I know I've talked to Tom McDonald and a few of your other 2-year college folks in the basketball space. And I think there's some wanting of the 2-year college intercollegiate events to possibly be rescheduled in that July timeframe if we don't extend the dead period. So TBD on all of that. We'll keep you posted. But generally, we continue to have this COVID dead period right now where there really isn't any going out and recruiting at any events. There's no on-campus happenings for recruiting prospects. It's just your general normal kind of calls and emails and all that kind of stuff to your prospects. So I'll slide into the NBA pre-draft process, and this is more of a being transparent to the groups that we've been talking with about just kind of where we're at on different items. So just as more of an FYI, our NCAA legislated deadline for a student athlete to remove his name from the NBA draft, that has been pushed back. The NBA is in talks to, finish their season this year in a couple of different locations. They've moved back their draft combine. It usually takes place in Chicago. They've now moved back to the actual draft. So we're anticipating that will probably take place in the early fall months potentially. So what does that look like for our group? The Men's Basketball Oversight Committee in the NABC has put forth some recommendations for a couple options for the membership and that Council Coordination Committee to provide feedback on as to what's the best option for our student athletes that are trying to pursue a career in the NBA, and how's that best work in this kind of strange environment that we're in right now, with maybe pulling out at a later date and still maintaining your eligibility. So that's more of a 30,000 foot just general update, because we've been getting a lot of questions from all kinds of people, not even just our Division I membership, but just to put on your radars as well. Greg, can we go back real quick to the recruiting? I want to say on this, we continue to get these updates from the Council Coordination Committee, Council, MBOC, our Men's Basketball Oversight Committee, continues to review options as what we're going to do in the summer and fall. So we have an internal working group put together right now that is working with the MBOC and with the NABC on kind of a, contingency plan or a modification of our recruiting calendar, at least for Division I. And what that looks like is, can we get those 2 AAU weekends back from April? Can we get the 2 June weekends for our high school scholastic events and our 2-year college intercollegiate events, and move those maybe into July if the temporary dead period is not extended? If the temporary dead period is extended, what's that look like for August, September? Can we modify the recruiting calendar and not pull prospects and kids out of school for events to go get recruited at, but can we utilize some of those weekends in the fall to maybe make up for what was missed? And with that, the NABC created a list of guiding principles that the MBOC endorsed earlier in May that really focuses on maybe 8 to 10 key points on, not necessarily a return to play kind of model, but if you will, a return to recruiting kind of model for that late summer, early fall time period. So what that means is, health and safety is at the front of it all, and the utmost importance for event operators, staff, coaches, prospects, anybody involved. Fiscal responsibility in this time where we know that budgets and everything is pretty tight. And then also still trying to provide an opportunity for high school kids and two-year college kids that are prospects looking to become, NCAA Division I student athletes to get noticed, to be seen, have participation opportunities to get recruited, and obviously earn some scholarships. So that's just a quick update. Obviously, a lot of this is still TBD. It's very fluid. New updates come in daily. So for today, that's the update. Tomorrow it could be something different, but we'll continue to keep everybody in the loop. And then if questions come, please feel free to reach out to myself or Greg Dana, and we can help walk through what's going on from a basketball perspective related to all this COVID-19 stuff.
Super. Thank you, PJ. And again, folks, we'll hold questions for PJ because I know he's got to jump to another meeting, and we've got some other things we want to handle. And if we have questions at the end, time for questions at the end, we can get to that. I'll probably warn you that this is the area where I have the least ability to be helpful. So again, your basketball specific and some are recruiting specific questions we'll probably have to get back to you on. But PJ, thanks so much for going through that with us.
All right, thanks, Greg. Thanks all.
It's going to move to name, image, likeness, and 4-4 transfers, which again doesn't directly impact your student athletes, but talks a little bit more about the overall transfer space in Division I, which is relevant to the big picture. So Jerry Vaughn is with us, and Jerry's going to take us through those two items.
Thanks, Greg. So yeah, I think name, image, likeness, certainly we'll talk about kind of what we're doing on the NCAA front, but I do think some of you have been kind of tangentially impacted by some of this whole discussion, maybe most importantly, the state legislation out in California, talking about, kind of liberalizing some of those rules and allowing student athletes to receive compensation for the use of their NIL. So certainly I think it probably is an issue, a hot button issue in your associations as well. But for our purposes and what we're going to talk about today, recently you've probably seen the Board of Governors adopted some recommendations from a working group that was compiled to study this issue of name, image, and likeness, and how our membership could allow student athletes some flexibility in the name, image, and likeness space without kind of blowing up the collegiate model. So recently, in April, the Board of Governors accepted a report that basically says we're comfortable with the divisions going and studying these areas outlined on the screen. So our NIL activities that we're talking about really kind of fall in one of two buckets. The first is a student athlete receiving compensation for his or her business activities, right? So think about a young person who maybe is a social media influencer on Instagram, or a young person who writes a book that has nothing to do with athletics, or maybe it could even have something to do with athletics. But the idea, right, is that our young people kind of have these entrepreneurial spirit, and maybe our legislation shouldn't treat them different than the regular student body at an institution. So that's the first bucket. The next bucket is just kind of the foundational example of NIL, right? Can a student athlete be compensated for signing autographs or for appearing in a commercial, endorsing or promoting a third-party commercial product? Again, I think there has to be some guardrails to guard against some of those activities. I think, very early on, our membership expressed concern about the recruiting process and how some of this flexibility could inherently cause some issues there. So our membership has spent a lot of time and still is spending time developing what some of those appropriate parameters are. There's another bullet here on the screen about allowing young people to use agents or advisors in connections with some of those activities. The idea here, right, if you're a young person running a business, you probably want to have somebody on your team to review contracts or to help advise you on tax implications of some of this new revenue, how that could, potentially impact your eligibility for financial aid. So the idea here is that those young people would have access to quality professional service providers, is the language that we're using, that really any other student on campus would have access to help advise them in connection with using some of these NIL activities and receiving compensation for that. Next slide, Greg. So again, we've kind of spent a lot of time, I would say the last 6-8 months or so, developing guardrails around these activities. So some of the guardrails that the membership has kind of generally been supported, and there's pretty good consensus around. One is this idea that the institution cannot be involved in the development, operational promotion of the student athlete's business or activity or service. I think they're one of the things to be mindful of, and at least our working theory is that if the institution is involved in some of those things like organizing or arranging activities, what are the potential Title IX implications of that, right? So the idea is that these NIL activities operate in a free market system so that an institution doesn't necessarily have to be concerned about providing equitable opportunities for all genders, because it's the market kind of making those decisions. But if an institution is involved in those activities, then I think their burdens start to look a little bit different in complying with those federal laws. The next guardrail that folks generally support is that the student athlete's work product or service can include reference to the student athlete's involvement. So I can say I'm a student athlete at Cherry Vaughn University, if that's what any other student on campus could do, right? If I have a famous guitarist on my campus and they go book shows and say, hey, come check me out at Cherry Vaughn University, that would also be permissible for a student athlete to do. I think we've heard some concerns, and it kind of goes with that last bullet on the screen there about if a student athlete is representing an institution, what about those activities that maybe conflict with institutional values, right? If I have a student athlete out in, I don't know, an adult entertainment business and they're promoting that, well, do I really want that connected with my institution? So the idea there is that an institution might be able to create some clearer policies about these are the types of activities in which you can participate in as a student athlete representing my institution, and these activities are clearly off guard. So there's some general consensus there. There's also consensus around maybe a prohibition against student athletes participating in activities that would jeopardize their eligibility potentially. Think about sports wagering, right? If our legislation still says it's not permissible for a student athlete to engage in sports wagering, is it really prudent for a student athlete to be out promoting and endorsing a casino or some other company that traffics in that space? So that's the idea there. The other big thing that our groups have talked about is this idea of disclosure requirements. So this concept would require student athletes to disclose certain information about their activities. Who are you in business with? What does your compensation agreements look like? Are you involved with any boosters in this space? So the idea there is that the institution can kind of gather that information to spot check and see if there's any red flags. So this isn't necessarily akin to an institution having to approve an NIL activity, but it's really meant for a student athlete to provide information so an institution can kind of do their due diligence to make sure everything is on the up and up. So there's been a lot of conversation about that. Potentially there's conversations about a third party being involved in that. Maybe there's some sort of national clearinghouse that you report all of those NIL transactions to. I think the membership is still kind of having various discussions about that, but all of that kind of centers around disclosure requirements. So a lot more work to do in this space. Again, those two broad buckets are probably going to stay the same, but I think everything else here, including guardrails, are still being developed. The timeline right now is for the membership to have proposals presented. I think it's at the October meeting to go into the legislative cycle to be voted on by January of 2021 to be effective for the August 2021 academic year. So for NCAA standards, it's a quick moving train, but I think it's one that has a lot of reputational risk associated with it. So it's one that our membership has to get right. So that's all I have to say about that. 4-4 transfer is another evergreen topic that it feels like we've been talking about for the last 10 years or so. At this most recent Division I council meeting, the council adopted a resolution that basically says by January of 2021, the Division I membership will adopt legislation that addresses this transfer issue in a comprehensive fashion. Some of the bullets there on the screen, I think, it was a big step for the Division I membership, at least to recognize that student athletes are a lot like their peers. And we know that the data tells us that approximately 1 out of 3 student athletes students generally transfer. So why would we potentially disadvantage our student athletes from making a decision that the vast majority of their peers make as well? Also, I think it was a big step for their membership to recognize that second bullet there. For so long in the 5 sports that are prohibited from using the one-time transfer exception, this idea has been that, transfers detrimentally impact the student athlete's academic progress. So I think it's a little bit maybe more of a nuance to that statement to say that the data doesn't necessarily indicate that every student athlete in those sports benefit from serving an academic year of residence. And then again there, right, this idea of uniformity. Is it really defensible to treat student athletes in those 5 sports different than their peers that participate in the other sports, particularly when the one-time transfer seems to be working really well in those sports? And do we have rationale to treat those 5 sports differently? So the membership said there's a whole host of issues around this transfer issue that we have to get settled out, APR and financial aid in football with counters and tampering and all those other things that undoubtedly come up when you start to talk about transfers. The membership said we're going to spend some time thinking about it, but no later than January of 2021, there's going to be a comprehensive legislative package to address all of those issues for the membership to vote on. Is there another slide there, Greg? Nope, that's it.
All right, Jerry, thank you so much for doing that. Are you going to be able to stick around for questions, Jerry, or do you need to run?
Nope, I'm here.
Okay, so if you have a question for Jerry at the end, we can get back to that if we get through the rest of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about D1 academics, and that is really where I spend most of my time. And again, thinking more specifically about your student athletes, the 2-4 transfers, and how do I get your kids onto our campuses to get them that next chapter of their academic and athletic careers in college. So we'll talk about transfer legislation, we'll talk about progress towards degree, and we'll talk a little bit about seasons of competition. I'm gonna focus in Division I. I'll talk a little bit about Division II. As you guys all know, Division III is deregulated academically. Those are institutional decisions. So mostly focus here on Division I. I'll mention D2 just a little bit. There's been a lot of talk about, are we waiving requirements for transfers due to COVID? And the answer, similar to what Danielle was talking about with seasons of competition in the academic space, is the same. And that is, we want to look at every case individually in our waiver process to look at each kid. In the 2-4 transfer space, we have to walk up to the issue that 2-4 transfers do present, holistically in the data, a higher risk of graduation from the 4-year school than a kid who matriculated a 4-year school and goes straight through in 4 years. So with graduation being the anchor of everything we're trying to do, we recognize that looking at the whole 2-year college record gives us the best picture of which student athletes are ready to come in and compete right away while they're doing their academics, and which student athletes could benefit from sitting a year and working on academics first before they go back into competing while going to school. I have specific examples in a minute here about how we'll apply COVID to that process, but the first point I wanted to make is because of those two kind of foundational things that we've seen from years and years of doing this, there is no automatic flexibility due to COVID for kids who don't meet the 2-4 transfer requirements coming in Division I. I also want to recognize right up front, having been doing this for many years, there's not going to be a lot of kids, especially your non-qualifiers who went to your schools, who in 3 terms got all their requirements done. Everybody needs all 4 terms and some summers to get all their stuff done to come to the 4-year school. So we do expect the volume might be a little bit higher, but we're going to take that into account when we look at the waivers. And so again, before I get into the examples, I want to talk a little bit about our percentage of degree requirements too. And we talk about this with with all of you all in the 2-year college community all the time. To be eligible immediately, your transfers have to meet the transfer requirements. They also have to meet our 40, 60, 80 in Division I, and that's after 2 years, they have to be at 40% of the degree. After 3 years, they have to be at 60, and after 4 years, they have to be at 80%. And that's for all of our Division I student athletes in order to stay eligible. And it's the same thing. We're going to look at all those cases as an individual in the waiver process. There isn't automatic flexibility on that because graduation in 5 years is still a fundamental principle of Division I. And I will tell you just right up front, it's going to be a lot of your kids that don't meet it because it's really hard to get there in 4 terms. And if you're a 6 semester kid at 2-year school, it's almost impossible to get to 60. Take away a semester, because of COVID, there's going to be more kids who are running up against that rule. So we'll see them in the waiver process, but we know COVID's out there. So let's talk specifically about how we're going to look at those cases. And I wanted to go into these examples because you've got kids on your campuses who are these kids that are going to come to our campuses next fall, hopefully. And you need to be able to look at those situations and properly advise them and say, hey, you've got a good chance. You've got work to do. So let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to put the whole slide up, a couple examples. And all of these are in the COVID world. And when I say in the COVID world, what I mean is that spring, it's almost a no-go, right? We recognize as educators 2 things. First of all, COVID directly impacted some kids that got sick. Their family members got sick. They had housing implications. People lost jobs. So all of those things impact the kids' ability to do school. Secondly, even if you didn't have that directly impacting you, if you're a student of any ability, teaching yourself math is hard. So we believe, and I know, and you all know, that teachers are important, and that's why we have this educational system in this country we have. So going from my teacher was teaching me every day to I have to teach myself this online and I'm not used to that is difficult, and it's going to negatively impact a lot of academic records. So we know that going in, and there's going to be a lot of grace given to those kids because of those 2 realities that had to do with spring 2020. So specifically, what does that mean? Your kid that looked like they were on track going in after 3 terms, we're not going to have a lot of trouble with that record. So in this example, after 3 terms, the kid had 36 transferable hours, so he's meeting the average of 12. He had over a 2.5. COVID happens, he fails some things, his GPA drops, but before that, he was firing on all cylinders. We're going to wave that kid through. He's shown he can do school. We're not going to hold him accountable for not getting all the way there or for a drop in his performance due to COVID. So your kids who were firing on all cylinders, it's really important that we know that even if they fall short, and we know that many of them will, don't have to worry about them in the waiver process. And we're communicating this to our schools as well. Our middle ground example, kid wasn't all the way there, but he was pretty close. And we know this, a lot of your kids, especially if they need some remediation in that first term, they're using that 4th term in that summer to get there because they didn't come in the way you wanted them to come in, and they had to catch up a little bit. That's a bunch of your kids, and we recognize that. So this student athlete who didn't have his average of 12 but was pretty close had the 2.5, or at least had it in the most recent term, so he showed that after you did your term of remediation with him or her, that he was doing school and he was doing college and he was doing it right. Passes 6 of 12, so he fails some stuff, GPA drops. He's got his English and math and science. Again, we're looking at that whole record and we're thinking about, was this, he remediated after a term and he's been doing his real college work the last couple of terms and he looks good. So he was in Psych 101, he was in Social 101, he was in Geology, he was in English, he was passing them. That's a college student. We're not going to be worried about that kid. Same exact record here, but kid was in a lot of coaching basketball and playing basketball and, some of those, more athletically related courses, hiking. My internal joke is bass fishing all the time, but that exists, right? And he was holding off to the end to do his college stuff. That one's going to be tougher. So that's why we look at the whole record. But the kid who in the last couple of terms was looking like a college student, knocking out those requirements and passing his stuff, they're going to have a better chance of getting that waiver. The kid who hadn't done much and was trying to catch it all up in the end, probably looking like they might sit a little bit, or we might go into doing some conditional type waivers if they're a spring sport or a winter sports student athlete. So the borderline kid, it's all about that record and how much of that, real academic college had they done prior to COVID to show us that they could do college and compete at the same time. I'll move through this one a little bit quicker because I just talked about it. Same record, but the GPA was lower. So This is an important distinction because that GPA is a really big indicator of success at the 4-year level. So if in 3 terms at your school, the kid didn't have a 2.5, that's going to be tough to say he was going to do all those requirements in the 4th term and do well in them enough to get that average of 2.4 up above 2.5. That's a little bit of a leap, right? Now we're putting kids in classes they've never taken and we're assuming a grade. And that's tougher for us to do in the waiver process. So the kid who didn't have a 2.4 or a 2.5 in his transferable classes before COVID, that's a tougher case. So again, if the record's looking really good in the recent term, and he had his hiccups when he was getting remediate at the beginning, that kid's going to get some grace. And if he kind of was not doing well every term, that's going to be a tougher waiver for us. And that's my final example. This isn't COVID or not. This is kind of the waiver we've always had trouble with, and that's the kid who's failed something every term. And you guys see this because they're on your campus, that's the kid who takes every class twice, right? He takes the first time, he fails, he takes the second time, he gets a C or a B, and that F falls off. But that's not really a kid who's ready to come in and be ready to compete immediately at the D1 level while he's taking 300 level classes. So that's not really a COVID kind of case, and that's how we'll look at it. But the main point I want you to take away from this discussion is we recognize that spring 16, we recognize 2 things. Spring 2020 is a wild card. We recognize that summer doesn't exist for a lot of these kids to do the catch up. And we're going to really be focusing on that record beforehand. And if the kid looked like he had demonstrated that he could do college and compete at the same time, that kid's going to get a lot of grace in the waiver process. So you're going to have kids who you normally wouldn't expect falling short, who do fall short because of COVID, but give them to us, and we're going to do our very best to apply grace in that waiver process to get them onto that D1 campus as much as possible. I want to talk a little bit about graduation. Graduation is one of our requirements for our non-qualifiers who are 424 transfers and for our 2.4 transfers. And we recognize that graduation on your campuses was impacted by a lot of kids. And we also recognize that a lot of kids had those last couple of graduation requirements they had to get, they didn't get because of COVID. Our data shows us very clearly that it's about transferable GPA and English, math, science. So that's why in those examples I talked about that. We're going to be looking at what's the GPA in the transferable courses, and we're going to be looking at how they did in English, math, science. Your kid didn't graduate, don't worry about that. That's not going to hang a kid up because, again, spring 2020 was a mess. So don't be as worried about that requirement as you're advising your kids. Again, let's focus really hard on the transferable GPA, English, math, science. If they didn't have the transferable GPA and they could do something online that would transfer over the summer, I'd say they need to do it because that's going to be a big deal if they have the transferable GPA when they come through the waiver process. Joe, that's what I had. So where are we doing on time? We're at 10 till. All right, I had a couple of questions. I think Joe sent out to the group a request for questions, and I had a couple come in beforehand. So I'm going to take those 4, and we'll see where we're going on time. And Joe, how's the chat look? Do we have other questions?
We have a question, but I think it was directed towards PJ, so you can do your best to answer it.
So you picked the one topic that I can't answer. Let me do the ones that came in via email in advance, and then we'll go to what's in the chat. Pass-fail grades. That's really not, a lot of people went to pass-fail grades. We recognize that. That's going to impact the transferable GPAs. That's going to go to institutional policy. So we as the NCAA aren't going to say, here's how we're going to handle pass-fail grades. We are going to say to each institution, figure out what you do with transferable grades and put them in your, calculate your transferable grade point average based on your institutional policy. Now, if our receiving institution says that all those P's are C's, that kid's not going to have a 2.5. So they're going to be in the waiver process. But they get the same grace I was just talking about. We're not going to want the pass-fail to hurt the kid. If the kid had the 2.5 with the other stuff, we're going to say he's a 2.5 student. If he had a 2.2 with the other stuff and it all went pass-fail, we don't have the evidence that he was a 2.5 student at the 2-year school. So again, we'll give the grace. We're going to try not to let the pass-fail hurt the kid, and it's really going to be about what they did before. Competing part-time. So it's interesting to me, we've got an awful lot of people trying to figure out how to not hit 40 or 60%, right? And we've had a lot of conversations one-off about if I go part-time, even some of your sanctioning institutions, 3C2A, NJCA, and NWAC have talked about part-time, allowing competition while part-time enrolled. And I don't know where each of your associations is going to land. We have a rule in Division I that if you compete in intercollegiate athletics during the term, it counts. So going part-time to try to save a semester so that you don't hit 40% or 60%, but while you're competing for your two-year school, that isn't going to work. So if your kid's going to compete in the term, put them up to 12 or 15 or whatever and try to get to the requirements. Now, if you're a baseball player and you want to take fall off and you're not going to compete and your baseball coach says, I don't need you in fall ball, then that term doesn't count because you took the term off. And that's COVID or not COVID. That's how the world works. If you're not in school for the term, it doesn't count. But if you're in there competing for your institution, we're going to count it even if you're part-time. So be careful about that advice. I've seen a lot of that floating around, and I want to make sure we don't give bad advice to the kids. Big obstacles to learning in the COVID environment. What are the strategies we can implement at the two-year colleges we have with the limited resources you have? That's probably its own hour presentation, and I'm not the guy to give it because I'm not the educator, but it goes back to what I was saying is we recognize that COVID impacts kids either directly because of the stuff I talked about where it impacted their family or their job or their income or their housing, or indirectly just because online learning's hard. And that's not just for the two-year college kids, it's for the four-year college kids, it's for the high school kids, for the grade school kids. So we're gonna look at that and give a lot of grace to that semester. As far as strategies for the two-year school at this point, if you've got kids that are trying to come to our schools in the fall, I think you're talking about what can they do online, how can you support that online learning if they need it to get the GPA up. Or again, if they have no English and no math, getting something done in the summer would give them a better shot in our waiver process. And then the final question we had was about the transfer portal, and I think there was some confusion about the transfer portal. We have a transfer portal in NCAA Division I and Division II that student athletes who want to transfer from a Division I school to Division I school enter, put their name in to tell all those other Division I schools, hey, I'm recruitable. And so it's the way we manage recruiting from one Division I campus to another, or from one Division II campus to another. Two-year college student athletes don't go into the portal. It really doesn't have anything to do with getting your kids onto our campuses. So again, if there's questions about the portal or confusion about how the portal works, send those to me offline. But because it came in, I wanted to address that any changes to the 4-4 environment, or when we talk about what's going on in the portal, which Jerry didn't mention in his presentation, which is good, that relates to 4-4 transfers. And your kids don't go into the NCAA portal. They get recruited by our individual institutions and brought onto campuses on a one-on basis, and that's the same as it's always been. So I did forget one point I wanted to make because I did such a heavy focus on Division I with the academics and all the waivers are coming to the national office. In Division II, they just last week announced, so it's late enough last week that it didn't even make my presentation, that they're going to allow some campuses on the Division II level to apply some flexibility to their two-year college transfers without sending it to the NCAA national office. I believe that flexibility will look similar to those examples I gave, but it hasn't been designed yet. So there will be a difference if you have kids looking at both D1 and D2, where they're getting different messages between the divisions. And that's because the Division II institutions are going to have more flexibility to apply some of this stuff on their campuses, and the D1 schools aren't. So you may hear from a D2 school, I can look at your record and you're good, come here, I can make you eligible. That could be a true statement. And the D1 school could look at the exact same record and say, I don't know, I have to file a waiver for you. So just be aware, again, as our different divisions do different things, that Division II, within the last 5 days, got some more flexibility with the 2-4 transfer legislation, and they're going to have to start defining what that means. And we haven't even rolled that out for our membership, and they haven't even defined it yet, but be aware that that's going to exist as you're talking about differences between D1 and D2 schools with your kids. And to PJ's point, it changes every day. So we'll do another one of these in a month, Joe, and we'll give you all new information. So that's what I had. Joe, do you have other questions?
Yeah, just the one question about the extension of the dead period. There was a ask if there potentially was an option for the August, September events as being available if that dead period gets extended. Has there been any discussion about that?
They're discussing everything. And I will tell you that the basketball group is more ahead of the all other sports group, I think. So, basketball's working with the coaches associations. PJ kept referring to the MBOC. That's our men's basketball oversight committee. Since basketball has such a regimented summer where there are such limited opportunities and you have to fit such specific requirements, they're trying to figure out how to fit that into later time periods. With all of the other sports, the dead period's to the end of June, and I think they're talking about what models would look like if it's lifted at June. What does July look like? What does August look like? If it's not lifted in June, what does it look like? But I think it's way too premature for us to get out and guess what August and September might look like. Everybody's really hoping, honestly, and you all live in different states, so you can laugh at me offline as needed, depending on what state you live in. But everybody's really hoping that we can get student athletes back on campus at some point this summer and get back to some sense of normalcy. But at this point, they're just taking it a month at a time, and that's the world we live in.
Great. Well, I think that's the conclusion of our presentation. I want to thank you all for attending. This presentation will be sent out to the membership in an email containing the link for viewing. And I would like to thank, again, Greg and the staff at the NCAA for joining us and presenting today. And I also like to thank Jason and the NATYCAA staff for coordinating this presentation. And just a quick reminder that we do have our business meeting scheduled for June 10th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So at this point, I want to ask you all, thank you again, and certainly stay safe, and this will conclude the presentation.